almost. And today I'm going to talk about economic policy, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So there's not a lot of good to say about U.S. economic policy right now. And as an economist, we tend to have a way of depressing people. So I'll try to avoid that and also look for some optimism. But I'm going to do the opposite of what the good, the bad, and the ugly says. I'm going to start with the ugly, then go to the bad, and then go to the good, and end with the good. Okay, so here's the ugly. We've all know this. Just a few days ago in the press, it said the US debt level has reached 100% of GDP, exceeding income. Now, note that that's never occurred except right at the end of World War II. There was a big war going on. Lots of debt was sold, US bonds and, Uncle Sam and buy all the bonds. And we exceeded, but then gradually US debt declined. You see that process. But in recent years, particularly since the global financial crisis in 2008, our debt has exploded. And you can see, I'm using here levels of projections by the Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan entity in the US government that provides data for legislators. So it's nonpartisan. So what they're showing is a massive debt increase well beyond this fiscal 2026. It's gone up by 8 times since 2008. Oh, how do you get deficits? Well, you get how do you get debt? You get debt by running deficits. And that's the next slide, is showing basically what our deficit levels are. And basically, we've had deficits almost continuously in the last 50 years, but they've only really been large deficits that is above 5% of GDP on a couple of occasions. Once was in the Reagan deficits, where we had big tax cuts, but we also had a big recession. That's this period here. See the 5% level? And I'm showing as a percent of GDP. Why? Because GDP is basically the national income. And you want to debt relative to your income. In other words, if you were to look at my personal debt, I have a certain level, but relative to Warren Buffett, it would be nothing. He's got a much more high income level. So the point being is we always look at things, or very frequently look at things relative to GDP or our income levels to get a sense of the relative magnitude. And so that's why I'm looking at percent of GDP. And so the first over 5% was the Reagan deficit and a big recession combined. The second time was the financial crisis, 2008. Huge injections to keep the economy going. And the third time was the COVID recession. Remember, we had huge fiscal injections, that is government spending, checks being sent out to people on several of occasions, support of different industries and individuals, really quite massive fiscal injections. Or when I say fiscal, I mean government spending or tax policies. And then finally, the one time that we've seen it go over 5% most recently is with a strong economy. In other words, just recently, we saw a large so-called one big beautiful bill, which expanded our deficits very significantly, But it was done in the backdrop of a strong economy, not a recession or a weak economy. And that's what makes it unique. The projections you're seeing here, this is not showing up very well, this pointer, sorry about that. Do we have another pointer that works better than this, a black one maybe? But yeah, maybe turn down the lights a little bit, that would be good. We don't need lights on here, it can be dark. Kill the lights, thanks, kill the lights. That light in particular, if you could kill that in particular. Almost blinded up here. Well, it looks a little better here. But what you see here are projections continuing out. And so we reached in the most recent projection a 6% deficit. That's exceeding that 5%. And note that on average over the last 50 years, we've averaged about 4% deficit. So this is a new dimension for fiscal policy in the United States, where you have peacetime. It's not peacetime right now, but nonetheless, overall, this is, by the way, these numbers are coming in well before the Iran war numbers are coming in. We're not even including that in these fiscal deficits. Now, how do you get deficits? Well, you get deficits because of your spending exceeds your revenues. And that's what this shows. This shows, again, as a percentage of GDP, how US spending has exceeded revenues for most of the last 50 years. The only exception was here in the middle, if you can see this, going up there, where under the Clinton surpluses. Other than that, we've seen just systematically expenditures exceeding revenues. Now, most recently, you see a 6%, 5.8% deficit. That's the difference between the revenues of 17.5% and the expenditures of 23.3%. Now, the dashed lines are telling you what the average is over the whole period. And the averages are 21 and 17. That is 21% expenditures, a percent of GDP over 50 years, 17% of revenues, the difference being 4% average deficits. So looking at that, the question is why and what's going on? We want to ask the elephants in the room. The elephant is debt, deficits, and spending, and revenue. And so I just want to focus for a moment on interest payments. Interest payments in the United States have absolutely exploded. In some sense, they didn't look that bad when we had zero interest rates. After 2008 financial crisis, interest rates went to zero. And interest rates are the reason you pay high interest on your debt, plus the level of the debt, those two combined factors. A country like Japan's had massive deficits, but they've had zero interest rates for so long, it doesn't show up as much. But now we've got rising debt and rising interest rates, and that means we're having an explosion in interest payments. It's like your credit card company that's just decided that you're a difficult credit risk and has raised your interest rate from 1% to 5%. So let's look at that interest payments. And my argument here is that it's crowding out other expenditures. Some you may like, some you're not. I'm not trying to be partisan at all with respect to where you spend your money. I'm just looking at the financial issues when you're spending it on interest. When you're spending it on interest, this pie chart shows you all the different expenditures of the federal government in fiscal year 2005. By the way, the fiscal year ends at the end of April. So we don't have fiscal year 2006 yet for all the expenditure categories, but it's roughly the same. So the point here is that interest now is 14%. You see this number here, 14%, which for the first time ever is exceeding the expenditures on national defense. You know, many people like to say the US federal government is basically an insurance company with an army. And the reason they say that is because most of our expenditures are on Social Security, Medicare, health and medical, and then national defense, and add that to the net interest. So what we like to do as economists is determine or divide up the government expenditures into discretionary and non-discretionary. Non-discretionary basically means they'll continue to the next year unless there's new legislation changing. So Social Security, we have legislation that determines the specifics of Social Security spending, and unless there's new legislation, it will continue the next year. And same with Medicare and many others. But more than 70% of the expenditures are non-discretionary. So basically, when Congress is in there debating what they should do with expenditures, they're usually messing around with about 30% of the budget. And so when Elon Musk gets on stage with a chainsaw and says he's cutting US government deficits by taking out USAID, that amounts to 0.4% of the US budget. So, you know, first of all, the optics don't look good when the richest person in the world is cutting aid to the poorest people in the world. But from a purely economic perspective, you're not going to do anything significant with the deficit by knocking out that small portion of it. Just to give you a little bit different perspective on it, I want to talk about this long term. We've got long-term projections. The deficits in spending are going to get worse unless there's major changes. The main thing driving this are demographics. The second thing is more programs, more generous programs. So in terms of the long-term drivers, and based on my age and most of the audience, we're in this 65 and older population. And that 65 and older population, economists like to look at that as a percentage of the working age population. In other words, people between 18 and 64, which are in the workforce and fundamentally supporting the people who are retired. Well, that ratio, the ratio of 65 population and over to the working age population has gone up continuously. You know, roughly 20% for decades, and now it's surging upwards. Well, the good news is, I mean, why? Well, the good news is we're living longer. The second thing is health expenses tend to be concentrated in the later parts of life. And the third thing is we're getting much better healthcare. I spent a lot of time in Europe, and rarely do you see people who are retired getting hip replacements, knee replacements, and whatever can you replace. It's just not common. In the United States, it's commonplace. It's not just common, it's commonplace. And of course, that's a wonderful thing to allow more mobility as you get older, but it's expensive and it's new expenditures. So you add all these things together and you get higher expenditures on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So you add into the mix a dysfunctional budgetary process. I'm not a political science. I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to go into the details since I'm not, no time and I don't have the expertise on the specific workings of our Congress. But I can tell you that there's a budget process that was set up where you have individual committees debating bills that eventually go to Congress and you vote on 12 different appropriations bills, serious debates, serious discussion on the specifics. And then finally you have a resolution between the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the bill goes to the president. We haven't had that. in recent decade. What we see are these massive omnibus bills that the committees do work, but they put it together in a big, broader bill rather than separate specific bills, a big, broader bill, and you have very short time to vote yes or down on the whole thing. And the reason you do this is because under normal budgetary processes, you can have a Senate filibuster. That is, you need 60 votes to stop debate, which allows the bill to progress further for a vote. Well, because we've never had any type of compromise or consensus, where you never get to 60 votes in the Senate. So as a consequence, you circumvent the rules and to get legislation passed. The downside of that is you get this massive one bill where most of the Congress people don't even really know all the specifics. They're voting up or down. You got an up or down vote. Most recently, you had a 50-50 vote, and the vice president had to break the tie in the Senate to make it 51-50. That's how the big, beautiful bill was passed. And I just don't, it's not the first time, by the way. This is a sort of, it's become an aspect of our dysfunctional Congress, of no compromise. Now, what is the meaning of that then? What are the implications of that? Well, the implications are people are eyeing US government debt with more suspicion. All the major credit rating agencies, Moody's, S&P, and Fitch Ratings has downgraded US debt from the highest, still a very high rating, but it's no longer the highest. It used to be the gold standard. Why? One is high debt levels, but it's not just that. It's also whenever we have a crisis on the debt limit, we have a debt ceiling in the United States, which the way it works is that you pass a budget, you know it's going to have deficits and increase the debt, and then a couple months later you have a debt ceiling debate. You see, it's like as if they're two separate things, when in fact, once you pass the legislation and the president signs a law, you know the debt's going to go up, and then a couple months later you're debating the same issues. So in some sense, they're, I won't call it contradictory, but it seems it's a redundant debate. So we have those crises, which means the political impasse, plus the high level of the debt. The bottom line is they've downgraded our debt. Now, that means we're no longer part of what I call the AAA group. You see the countries there with all developed economies in the AAA group. We've left that group, even though the United States is the largest economy in the world. The dollar is the gold standard of financial investments, but our fiscal policy is out of control. Now, I like to look at a quote by Ernest Hemingway's book, The Sun Always Rises, where a friend was talking to Mike. And by the way, my name is Mike. So I asked him, how did you go bankrupt, Mike? Two ways, Mike said, gradually and then suddenly. And that's the fear, of course. Does anyone know this picture? Of course. So I just want to take a moment to say, what are the attitudes? How have attitudes of Americans changed about debt and priorities? You may or may not like the presidency of George H.W. Bush. But in 1990, he was facing deficits of 43% and a deficit of 4%. And he thought this was a huge problem and raised taxes and cut expenditures, and they passed legislation, which led to his defeat in 1992. And he had said in the political debate, presidential debates, read my lips, no new taxes. And he paid the political cost. But still, he did what he thought was the right thing, as as a responsible administrator of the US government. Now, contrast that with most recently a 5% deficit, debt approaching 100%, and they passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, increasing deficits by $500 billion. Now, this doesn't just reflect the president's priorities, it also represents how attitudes have changed about debt. It's no longer considered a pressing issue amongst other pressing issues. In other words, it's well down on the totem pole of priorities. So what about debt? You can default on debt. You can also inflate it away. Many countries have had very high debt levels and they allow inflation to run rampant. And so what you used to have was a $1,000 bond worth $1,000, but if inflation goes up by 500%, what happens? That bond becomes almost worthless. So that's one way of inflating away your debt. Another way is an outright default, as I said. But how about getting your fiscal house in order? Well, I myself have done a lot of research on fiscal rules, looking at international evidence and evidence in the United States and states within the United States on fiscal rules and what seems to work. Now, I've already mentioned a couple of fiscal rules. The debt limit is a fiscal rule. You debate in order to actually increase the debt, and you usually have political impasses at that point. But underlying all fiscal rules has to be some type of political consensus on the importance of long-term debt sustainability across the political spectrum, or at least the most important political power, political entities. Second, what you need fiscal institutions that work. And I'm not just talking about Congress, I'm saying other institutions. Like the Congressional Budget Office is actually a wonderful nonpartisan entity in the United States. It's under pressure at different stages over its history, but generally it gives very good data on what the budget implications are for any specific legislation. So you need that kind of monitoring and information. But you can also have codified rules, expenditure rules, what's known as structural deficit rules, a whole variety of ways of trying to put in place a more systemic approach to limiting how much debt you can issue. And then if you have feedbacks to policy actions, then you have budget responsibility and debt sustainability. Now, these vary by country and vary by time, over time. I just want to show you a quick graph on 3 countries here. United States, and by the way, the debt here is gross debt, not net debt. A lot of US government debt is held by other government agencies. Like the Federal Reserve owns a bunch of debt, US government debt. So when we looked at those others, 100% level, we netted out all the debt held by intergovernment agencies or government agencies. And so this is the gross debt. But you can see the gross debt of the United States in 2026 was 125%. It's got very weak fiscal rules. Germany, which has rather strong fiscal rules as part of the EU or the European Union, has a whole variety of fiscal rules on its member states, mainly in that charter imposed by Germany, or imposed or insisted upon by Germany, because they're very concerned with fiscal irresponsibility by member of the member states. And then we have an example of one of the EU members. It's not part of the monetary union, but is part of the European Union. So it is subject to so-called the Maastricht Treaty and fiscal rules, something called SGP, the Stability and Growth Pact. In any case, here's Sweden, which they introduced expenditure ceilings in the mid-90s when they started having a big debt increase. And then they established a fiscal policy council. That council basically monitors and gives critical reports. And it's independent of the government in office. So as a consequence, the public looks at it as a nonpartisan entity simply focusing on fiscal sustainability. And so over time, the result is you get much less debt levels. But having said that, you need the first point I made in the previous slide, political consensus. You can break fiscal rules. And some countries, like the United States, that's a normal process. Others, like Sweden, it would take a major political event. So that's why I'm asking in this slide, is it an insurmountable problem without that consensus? First of all, you can break or change rules. The US debt limit has increased 78 times since 1960. You know, our state of California has fiscal rules. And you know, whenever you have these emergency sessions of the state legislature coming together, it's not because we're on the verge of bankruptcy, it's because we're breaking our own fiscal rules, so you have to have another legislative session to try to balance the budget. Of our states, 39 in their constitution have budget rules. 10 others just have it in legislation. State of California has it in the state constitution and in legislation. So those are strong fiscal rules. And one of the important reasons is they can't print money. Our states can't print money, so as a consequence, they need fiscal rules. Now, the Congress, one way to try to implement policy is to delegate it to some independent agency. If you don't think you can control yourself, you get a trustee to do it for you. Well, on monetary policy, the United States has set up a trustee. It's called the Federal Reserve System, where you have an independent Federal Reserve and they run monetary policy. But you can't do that in fiscal policy. The heart of the Congress is budgetary actions. You want to fund a war, you need, in principle, you need the Congress to approve it. If you're running deficits, you need the Congress to approve it. They've got the power of the purse strings. In principle, that's not to say you can't circumvent them through emergency declarations and what have you. But overall, you can't delegate it over the longer term. Now, I've been talking about the ugly, and frankly, it is ugly. It's not insurmountable, but it is ugly. We need more of a sense of normalcy and a willingness to talk to others across the aisle, and more of a political consensus that we need to set up our priorities of what's important. We've lost that sense in the last decade. Now, I want to talk, when I'm talking about the bad, I just want to talk about our inflation surge that we've seen recently. But before doing that, I want to say there is a close link between monetary and fiscal policy. Let's look at that link. One, in the first page here, I show what the interest rate is, but the Fed sets interest rates. The Federal Reserve System sets something called the federal funds rate. That's a very short overnight interest rate that banks charge each other for money. But it has a big impact on the rest of the interest rates of the economy. But that's what the Fed does. Or when I say the Fed, I mean the Federal Reserve System. No disrespect by calling them the Feds. But anyway, you've got here just showing you that the federal funds rate, which is blue, you can see it's going up and down over the years. But generally speaking, the general outline of trends is the effective interest rate on US debt. So when interest rates are high, set by the Federal Reserve, that makes the cost of our debt higher. The second link is the Fed owns a lot of debt. And so what you see here on this chart is the Fed's, the blue is the total debt held by the public, and the red dot is how much of that or how much is the Fed holding of US government debt. And you can see the US debt levels jumped, as we all know about that, held by the public, but a lot of debt is held by the government and is blossomed. And so it was less than $1 trillion before the 2008 financial crisis, and today it's almost 6 trillion, sorry. So these are the two links between the two, fiscal and monetary policy. And frankly, you can't discombobulate those. You can't disentangle those. And so I'm putting this up just simply to showing you what in terms of billions of dollars, how much the Federal Reserve is actually holding of US government debt. So since we're talking about monetary policy now, or at least moving into that area, let's talk about the bad. When I'm talking about the bad, I'm only talking about the very specific inflation surge we saw in 2022. This period here, 9% inflation peak in 2022, June of 2022. And if you look at that across the spectrum, just from 2016 on, you see a period of really low inflation stability, just above a Fed target of 2%. And here, by the way, I'm looking at two numbers. I'm looking at the blue is the consumer price index. It's just a broad index of what consumers are spending on. And hundreds of items are in that, and they put it together and they issue it once a month, CPI. Then they do another index, which the Fed happens to like, is where you strip out of that energy costs and gasoline, housing oil, so forth, and you strip out energy costs and agriculture and the food. And the reason is because they're so volatile that you want them something over a longer term perspective. And they move together very closely over long periods of time. But nonetheless, this is the CPI. And you can see that our 9% June 2022, CPI went up by 9%. That was the bad. Now note that the other measure, stripping of energy and food prices, didn't go up near as much. Okay? So we saw a very stable period, the post-COVID shutdown here, a drop in prices associated with COVID, and then a huge jump and very rapid. Look how quickly it went up. And then a gradual reduction, followed by a most recent jump in the CPI associated with tariffs and the Iran war, closing of the Strait of Hormuz, oil prices jumping, shortages showing up. Why do we care? I mean, you've got a 9%, but it's gone. We're not seeing 9% anymore. But why are people complaining? Why are they talking about prices all the time? It's affordability. And inflation is a year-over-year measure, I'm showing you, of how prices have increased. But if you look at the cumulative, you put it together, those little numbers, 9% is not little, but if you look at the 4%, 5%, 6%, and so forth, you add them up, and the cumulative effect is a much higher level, not change, but level. And what we're seeing here today, prices are 25% higher than they were just 5 years ago. And that makes everyone nervous, particularly if you're on really tight budgets. So it's not just complaining, it's a general pattern. In particular, when you have bursts of inflation of 9%, it really pushes up this index, which I indexed it to 100 back in January 2021, and showed how those two indices have increased over time. Now, first of all, I just want to say the Fed was surprised by this. The Federal Reserve was surprised. You know, they've been having low inflation for so long that they were taken off guard. Now you ask yourself, how is that possible? They've got hundreds of economists. I myself worked for the Federal Reserve for years. Once I got out of graduate school, I worked for several years at the Federal Reserve and was a consultant with the Federal Reserve for 30 years. How did they make a mistake of this magnitude? Well, let's look at it first. Okay, the green line is what actually happened. And I've circled in red here. See, this circle is showing that 9% that we talked about. That's the green line. Now, this yellow or orange line, that's what the Fed forecast. In other words, the Fed has a bunch of models looking at inflation, and they were forecasting, sure, they thought inflation would go up, but they thought it would be like 3% or maybe most 4%. Of course, it popped up to 9%. So their models were off. And the models are based on judgment, surveys, history, and other factors. Very complicated and usually quite accurate models. But if you look at the survey of consumer expectations, this is the University of Michigan has a well-known survey they've been doing for 50 years or more. And they show that consumers early on were concerned about inflation right after COVID. And that is the blue line. So you see that blue line started to jump already in May 2021, well before we had the surge in inflation. And then it went up almost, 5.5% or so. Now that's not 9%, but still the surveys were suggesting 1 year ahead. The survey basically asks you, a representative set of individuals, consumers. They give them 100 questions. These are actually based on 5 main questions, and they put them together to see what the expectations are for inflation. So it was a big inflation surprise. And the question is why? Why did they make this mistake? Or why did the numbers for inflation come in much more than we had expected? Well, economists like to look at what we call shocks, big disturbances hitting the economy. Now, there's some outside your control, like COVID supply disruptions. It was only a few years ago, and my memories, I'm losing my memory, but remember there was a period of time when it was hard to get products. There was all the supply chains. I was trying to order, I remember now, a washer machine. And I wanted a particular brand. They said, well, we'll get it. And it'll just take 6 months and it'll be there. 6 months. And if you remember back to that period of time, there were supply disruptions, hard to get products. You had long waiting times. What do manufacturers do in those periods of time? If there's a huge supply shortage, they raise prices. And of course, that's what they did. So you had supply disruptions and price increases. Then you had a lot of pent-up private demand. People couldn't spend under COVID the same way they were, confined to their homes oftentimes, or very limited. Well, once COVID restrictions were released, there was this spending boom in the private sector.
I started thinking, well, the
and
pillow's still in there.
Remember what was the peak inflation?
Oh, wow, that's
June
good.
2022. What happened in February?
It doesn't really smell in here, but
Russia invaded Ukraine.
Jacuzzi bathroom and the den.
Oil prices
We've got to do
spiked.
something. It's making me sick.
And that was a contributor. So these are the 3 main contributors to our 2022 inflation. Totally outside of the Fed, totally outside any policymaker in the United States, pretty much. But there are also self-inflicted shocks. These are that are presumably under your control. There was an excess, most economists believe there was excess fiscal stimulus. That second check you got? Most people it was too late in coming, and the crisis had passed. And so it still gave a huge demand spending to the economy, but it wasn't necessary to get you out of a recession because we were already well out of the recession. The second thing is, and that's what I'll talk a little more about, is the Fed was slow to raise interest rates. And then, just to throw this in, 2 other things, not the 2022 surge, but the most recent, tariff increases and Iranian war and oil price increases. Now, These, I'm arguing, are both self-inflicted. Tariff, obviously, but also it's a choice to go to war. And you knew that oil prices would rise. I don't think many people thought they would rise as much or for as long as they have, with no decline in sight. Now, this is where the Fed was slow to respond. So if you want to criticize the Fed for inflation, just look at their mistake. The mistake was they waited too long to raise these short-term interest rates. So what do we have here? Basically, just looking at 2020, you know, the shaded area is a recession. These are all the recessions we've seen. Here's the recession. And the blue line is consumer prices. You know, they dropped. They dropped to virtually zero. So the Fed dropped interest rates. The green is the interest rates. See how they dropped interest rates to zero? They had been basically zero up into this point to 2015. And then they started to raise them to more normal levels. But then they dropped them again when they saw this COVID crisis. And they kept them low up until the beginning of 2022. But meanwhile, inflation started to increase. And you can see this delay here. This period of time is when the Fed should have increased interest rates more aggressively, sooner and higher. So that's it. We're talking about maybe 9 months. The Fed wasn't alone, by the way, in making this mistake. If you look around the world, comparable countries had issues. That is, if you look at the Euro area, United Kingdom, Canada, and others, you see that same surge. The United States is sort of in the middle of that surge. You know, you're reluctant to raise interest rates for obvious reasons. So I just have a few minutes left, so I'm going to talk about I've spoken about the bad, the ugly, the bad, and let's flip to the good. First of all, the good is that the Fed was working. We had almost achieved a soft landing. Inflation was coming down. There was no recession, and that's what you call a soft landing. Remember, the Fed has two mandates. It has a full employment mandate, or as maximum employment attainable under price stability. The Fed's looking at employment and at prices. So a soft landing means that it's able to keep the economy going strong and at the same time lower inflation. That's the outcome you desire. But tariffs hit and oil prices jumped, and that's where we are right now. The most recent numbers are 3.8% inflation of the CPI. But more worrisome is the producer prices, which is another measure, that is what producers are facing in terms of their input costs, are 6%. So that's a big jump. So one final chart on this phase is simply that, and this is by my friend Carl Walsh, who is also a retired professor of economics, and he just made this presentation a couple of weeks ago in Washington to the Federal Reserve on being critical of what they had done. And he's put together two things. You know, we had a big inflation in the early and late 70s, and we had a double dip recession. This is when Volcker came in and raised interest rates to double digits and stopped inflation. But this is the pattern. If you start zero at January 1970, you can sort of see what happened to inflation. Inflation declining, then it jumped up. That's 71. And then it started to decline, but it jumped up again in the latter part of the 70s. And then finally, Volcker stopped it and it came down. That's the blue line. Where are we now? So if you go back and sort of look at that target and you start at July 2017, that right here, we're right along our inflation target of 2%. Then the COVID hit. That's the decline in prices. And then suddenly a jump. And then a decline. This is the soft landing. And right now is where we are. Are we going to go back to where it was before or not? We're not out of the woods yet. Okay, so the Fed has been under unprecedented attacks. And President's called the chair Powell, chair until Friday. We have a new chair as of today's Sunday, 2 days ago. So he's called Powell a loser, numbskull, incompetent, crooked. Why? Because he won't lower interest rates. They've attempted legal actions against a Fed board member and also against Powell that was finally dropped by the Justice Department. But still, it's the first time in history that the Fed chair has been accused of essentially misleading testimony to Congress, is what the charge was, on budget allocations on a new building. We've now have a new chair named Kevin Warsh, who's been he actually was on the Board of Governors, and he's been a critic of the Fed. And finally, I want to show you
I welcomed the announcement last Friday by the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia that she had closed the criminal investigation. However, that she would not hesitate to restart the investigation.
Okay, I'll go back.
I welcomed the announcement last Friday by the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia that she had closed the criminal investigation. She also noted, however, that she would not hesitate to restart the investigation. Over the weekend, the Department of Justice provided assurances that they will not reopen the investigation unless there's a criminal referral from the Fed's Inspector General. I've said that I will not leave the board until this investigation is well and truly over with transparency and finality, and I stand by that. But these legal actions by the administration are unprecedented in our 113-year history, and there are ongoing threats of additional such actions. I worry that these attacks are battering the institution and putting at risk the thing that really matters to the public, which is the ability to conduct monetary policy without taking into consideration political factors. After my term as chair ends on May 15, I will continue to serve as a governor for a period of time to be determined.
Okay.
I plan to keep a low profile as a governor. There's only ever one chair of the Federal Reserve Board. When Kevin Warsh is confirmed and sworn in, he will be that chair.
That was the good. In other words, I'm arguing now.
Welcome back, Mr. President. That was quite a journey you took.
Yep, I did what
Thank
every
you.
doctor recommends for an 80-year-old.
Given the time, I'm going to skip over
I just flew off
some
from
detail,
China, and
but
boy,
I'm
are my
arguing
legs
that the
swollen.
Fed is one of the best institutions
sir.
the
That
United
doesn't look
States
good
has
at all
ever
what I'm
created.
talking about.
It's a very complicated
You know what?
institution.
I'm
Remember
sorry I didn't take you with me to
1913?
China, JD. I would
Everyone
have,
was
but I
afraid of
didn't
New
want
York
to.
banks, but we had just had a
But I brought
financial
you a
crisis in
present that President Xi
1907.
Jinping gave me.
So they said, we need a new central bank
trap.
institution. They set up the
Very
Fed.
nice.
The Fed
What
is
did you give
based on
him?
12 Federal
Taiwan.
Reserve banks.
Now, JD, I need some time to
And our
relax
closest
and
is
to
San
not be around
Francisco
you.
Bank.
You want me to leave?
A
He's
board
the
of governors
Catholic.
in Washington.
Not enough for
And
me.
they have a complex set of how
Well,
they're
it's time for
elected,
one of my
how they're
patented
appointed.
mid-work
But the
naps.
board of governors are all
Just gonna
appointed by
rest
the
my head on
president
this gold bar
to
that
longer
Switzerland
terms,
gave me as a
which can be
straight-up
renewable,
bribe,
and then also
sweet
to the,
sleep of an addled, jet-lagged mind.
the chair appoints the chair. It's highly accountable to Congress. That is, the Fed is created, it's a creature of Congress, 1913 legislation, and overnight,
Don't worry, Donald. It's me, your
the
best
Congress could
friend,
just get rid of the
Jeffrey
Fed,
Epstein.
could get rid of the Fed and do whatever they wish.
Jeffrey, but I thought you were
there's
dead.
a lot of
I am,
institutional support
remember?
from the Fed
I killed myself.
for the Fed.
Wink.
And that's why they dropped the legislation, the Justice Department,
So, how you
not the
doing,
legislation,
Don,
but the
Not so good, Jeffrey. My approval ratings
investigation
in the 30s.
Oh,
of
the
Powell,
30s, gross.
because
Call me
one
when it hits
senator, a
17.
Republican, refused to go along with
Dark, very
the
dark.
new Fed appointee,
Dark situation.
Warsh,
So,
until
what are you up
that
to
was
these
dropped.
days, Jeff? How's that?
And it shows you there's a well
Really,
of
really
support
hot.
by financial markets
You
and
know
by the
me, I keep
Congress,
busy
and for the most part by
mahjong
the
every
American
Wednesday
people.
with
High degree of
Stalin
independence,
and John Wayne Gacy.
regional
That guy has
representation,
stories. What else?
transparency, and
Oh, I just wrote for
professionalism.
the Kevin Hart roast.
And they've changed
Had some
over
fun
time.
singers in
The
there.
way they,
What about you,
now we've
Donnie,
got
baby?
inflation
Any
targets.
fun
Now
summer
we have more
plans?
transparency.
Well, we've got the World Cup.
I have many
UFC
discussions
fight
with
on my
people who think
lawn
the
like
Fed
that
is
white
this
trash on World
mysterious
Star.
institution
And we're also
that we
doing
don't know anything
debate
about, and they
games where
operate
high school
by a
athletes come
cabal
from
of
all over the country.
bankers in New
Boing,
York.
yo, 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 yoing.
Now, within 5 minutes
Give
of
me
going on
some.
their websites, I
You
can
know
show
what?
them
This time,
exactly
I'm gonna
minutes
leave
of meetings,
you hanging.
transcripts of meetings, who was appointed, how long, when, who, where.
Wow, yeah.
And
Tremendous.
usually,
Man, we had some
unless they're a
fun
true believer,
times together,
usually
didn't we, Don?
they're swayed by the
We
evidence.
should have taken more pictures.
In any case,
No, it's really
the
bad
Fed
that we
is the
took
good.
any.
highly
Damn it.
competent,
I
professional,
miss you, homie.
nonpartisan.
In case you're curious,
And
like all
I'm not
ghosts,
gonna
I
go
have the
into
power
the details
to show
of the
you
Fed,
visions
but
of the future.
to thank you for
I'm
your
surprised there is one.
attention.
First, let me show you to where Christy Nome is at in 6
We have a
months.
few minutes for Q&A,
My
so
fellow Americans,
I'll run around
I know
if you raise your
exactly
hand.
what we need
But
to
you want to speak
transform
into this
country.
mic.
Oh, good. She's back in politics.
Okay,
Not
question.
exactly.
It's the Shark One vacuum cleaner, and for only $129.99, it's the best
Thank
way
you very
to clean
much.
up that mess your
It
dog
seems
made,
that
besides a gun. And it can even handle balloon scraps left over from when your husband's
The
giant
video that
balloon
Michael
breast
played is still
popped.
playing in the background for the Zoomers.
Oh,
I'm just
wow.
going
I
to stop it.
completely forgot about her husband's Belubies thing.
Hey, that's a credit to you, buddy. Your administration.
Yay.
Okay,
It was a YouTube
my
And I-
question is this.
of,
Oh.
sorry, go ahead.
The question relates to, you've described basically one half of the equation. The other half seems to be revenue issue. And that's purely political because it's taxes. Do you see that there is a possibility of a solution to this disconnect between the deficit levels, the interest we're paying out, and income by some manipulation of tax policy that would help ameliorate the problem and make the bad or the ugly not quite so ugly?
I feel very strong about this, actually. When you say manipulation, you mean raising taxes. And we just lowered taxes, but mainly by continuing existing tax cuts and increasing tax reductions. Now, a combination of expenditures and taxes are what most people think would solve the problem. But I have a friend, an Israeli friend, as a matter of fact, economist, and he says, it seems that the social contract in America is that the richest people pay almost no taxes and the working class people pay a lot of taxes. Now, we often hear that the top 1% of income earners are paying most of the taxes, and that's true. But remember that top 1% of income earners don't include everyone that has huge stock distributions, and they borrow against that. They borrow against their stock, so they pay no effective income tax on much of their income that goes to expenditures. And there's other ways the code have been set up. So yes, of course, we can make a fair tax code, but also some increase in taxes are likely to be necessary to truly make the ugly become just bad, not ugly.
Yeah. How do you see the Fed rate over the next 6 months?
The what?
Over the next 6 months? The interest
rates?
Fed rate.
This is a fascinating issue. I love this because Kevin Warsh is coming in. He's a competent person, by the way, but he was on for some years. He was on the board of governors. He was on the board of governors during the financial crisis, 2008. And now, after 5 years, you see detailed minutes, not just a summary, but detailed minutes of what everyone said, and lightly edited. And Warsh was against cutting interest rates much of the time. And he was against so-called quantitative easing, that is increasing Fed expenditure, purchases of government debt, mortgage-backed securities, and other factors. So he, what I would call, based on that evidence, is what we call an inflation hawk. Very concerned with inflation. Now, to get appointed to the board and as chair, he came off as just a big critic of the Fed. But underneath that, I suspect greatly that he's an inflation hawk still, and that he'll end up not even voting for interest rate decreases. Now, having said that, let me say that the chair does not determine Fed policy. You have the 9 board of governors, plus you've got other Federal Reserve presidents who are voting. So, consequence, the chair is one vote, but as a chair of a committee, the so-called Federal Open Market Committee, you have a lot of influence. But nonetheless, if most recent Fed actions have been staunchly keeping rates constant or wanting to increase. 3 members have wanted to increase interest rates. So as a consequence, I don't expect any. I expect interest rates to pretty much stay the same for the next 7 months.
Any other questions? Oh, he has one more.
He had one too.
Oh, there's somebody else.
Somebody got a hand? Ah, there we go. Sorry.
Wonder if you could comment on the stock market. Why are we seeing price earning ratios 100 to 1, and is that going to continue?
Wow. I don't predict that. I can predict pretty well Federal Reserve policy on short-term interest rates. Stock market is a different ballgame. And, obviously, if you look at the stock market, our gains, the increases, have been dominated by 5 big high-tech firms that are a large percentage of the S&P 500. And many of you have had careers in tech, and you can tell me what's going on. But I can tell you that from my perspective as an outsider, looking at price earnings ratio, price and other metrics, it looks terribly overvalued. And a big short on this market wouldn't be uncalled for.
Folks,
but I'm not predicting. I'm just telling you what.
I'm sorry to have to end the Q&A because it's 12 o'clock almost.
Yeah.
I'm going to fall. And I want to just thank you, Michael, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, I want to remind you that this space becomes a cafeteria dining space immediately after this meeting. And I also want to tell you that